Welcome back, my friends, and today we are going to talk about two supremely important pieces of punctuation. But before we do, kudos to those of you who got that reference. Now, let's start with colons. Use a colon after an independent clause, i.e. a complete sentence, when it is followed by an idea directly related to the independent clause. So let's look at what this means. Here we have the sentence: the vote was unanimous. The older candidate won the election. We have our colon right there. It's those two dots. That's a colon. Do not confuse it with a semicolon. And then there is our independent clause. So the vote was unanimous. That could be a complete sentence by itself. And because it could, it is an independent clause. If you aren't sure what those clauses mean, go back to the video a few weeks ago that talked about the difference between independent and dependent. However, you'll see here that we have an independent clause, colon, and then a little bit more information that describes the independent clause, and that is when we are going to use colons. Now, I'm going to go through a couple of examples. As I do so, I want you to look at them and figure out if the colon is being used correctly. Now remember your rules. Colons can only come after an independent clause, and they're used when the independent clause is followed by an idea directly related to the independent clause itself. Okay, let's dive in. I enjoy reading, hiking, and racing dirt bikes. Yes or no? Correct or incorrect? What do you think? The answer is incorrect, and here's why. I enjoy is not an independent clause. That cannot be a sentence by itself, and because it cannot be a sentence by itself, we cannot put a colon there. Let's look at our next example. You are required to bring your own equipment on the camping trip: a tent, sleeping bag, and fishing rod. What do you think? Correct or incorrect? This one's going to be correct. We have an independent clause here. You are required to bring your own equipment on the camping trip. That could be a complete sentence. And then it is followed by additional information that relates right back to it. And for that reason, that colon is used correctly. Now let's review colons real fast. Colons do not always go in front of a list. They only do so in some circumstances. This is a huge misconception with a lot of people. Colons don't always go in front of lists. They only go in front of lists when there's an independent clause and the list describes that independent clause. Number 2, colons can only come after an independent clause. Again, do not put them unless what comes before can be a complete sentence. And then finally, they are different than semicolons. And if you don't remember what a semicolon is, I did a video on it a couple weeks ago, so refer back to that. Now let's talk about dashes. Use dashes in the same way that you would use commas or parentheses to insert extra information into your sentence. Or you can also use dashes to emphasize an important point. Here's an example sentence for you. Upon discovering the errors, all 124 of them, the publisher recalled the books. There are dashes, and there is the extra information. So, a couple of weeks ago you watched a video on commas setting off non-essential information. Dashes can do that as well. Now, those of you who are familiar with music, here's an analogy for you. If a comma were to be something like a quarter note, a dash would be something like a half note, and a semicolon would be like 3/4, and a period might be a full. So what I mean by that is usually commas don't insert much of a break into a sentence. It's just a short pause. A dash is a little bit longer, a semicolon a little bit longer, and then a period breaks 2 sentences, so that's going to be our longest pause. So those of you who like music, maybe think of it that way. Now before we go on too much more, we need to point this out. Dashes are not hyphens. They're 2 different things. Here's a sentence to show you. No, sir, this is not a pet-friendly hotel. That is a hyphen. That is a dash. Now, hyphens have a very different job than dashes do. Hyphens connect 2 words and turn them into 1 word. Dashes are punctuation that set off important information or extra information. I'll say that again. Hyphens combine words. Dashes set off important information or extra information. Now, we aren't going to go into dashes too much because you aren't going to see many questions regarding dashes on the ACT. But here are a couple final points. Dashes can be used in a variety of ways. Authors use dashes just willy-nilly, pretty much however they want to. And usually dashes are used to kind of create some sort of a rhythm in the writing. Like I mentioned before, if you think of it in almost a musical context, dashes create a bigger pause than a comma might. And authors like that. They like being able to control the rhythm of their sentences. So a lot of authors will just throw them in wherever they want that extra emphasis or pause. However, that being said, the ACT will not test you on dashes in that way. The only way that you will see dashes being used on the ACT is to set off non-essential information, to insert extra information into a sentence. So, if you see dashes on the ACT, all you need to do is just check to make sure that information in the dashes isn't necessary to the sentence, or if it is. If the information is necessary for the sentence to make sense, then you should not use dashes. Dashes only are used if the information isn't necessary. So check, make sure that it's extra information. If it is, your dashes are good, but make sure that you have one on both sides of that extra information. You should be set. If you have questions, let me know.